speaker, I think we're about ready for Nick. Are you about ready? Like I said, we're kind of moving along because we're trying to beat the weather with this. And thanks again, Nick.
Well, hopefully the conference don't blow away on us. Technical issues. Jim? Yeah. What is the weather forecast?
It's supposed to get nasty right around later this afternoon, 6, 7. So we're trying to get things along.
And it's coming from
This
south.
same path like we did yesterday. Down there by office, it's already
You'll be playing that in the next exercise.
Well, thanks everybody. Glad everybody could get out and face the weather. Hope you can understand me all right. I've got kind of a weird accent. It's not a local one. It's not even Oklahoma, Texas, anywhere local. It's England, as you can probably guess. And what I'm going to speak to you about today is, as you can see, a transatlantic hunt for Bigfoot. And a lot of people, you know, when you think of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Abominable Snowman, the Yeti, everybody thinks of the United States, the Pacific Northwest Woods, or the Himalayas. China has the Yeren, Australia has the Yowie, Sumatra has the smaller ape-like creature, the orang pendek. We get reports from Africa, South America, Canada, but most people don't necessarily, if ever, for the most part, associate Britain with Bigfoot. And I guess that's reasonable. You don't necessarily think a small country of the size of Britain, which is only like 700 miles long, could be home to reports of creatures that look pretty much like what we see in the Patterson film. And yet, nevertheless, we get a lot of reports. And what's interesting is that the British reports are kind of similar to the American ones in the sense we get sightings of classic Bigfoot type creatures, but also wild man type reports. Now, if you go back into, say for example, the latter part of the 19th century over here, and you review a lot of the early newspaper reports of the day, you see stories of like wild men of the woods that actually sound far more like primitive humans than they do ape-like creatures. And that's actually what we get in Britain as well. We get sort of a broad combination of both camps, if you like, but also reported in the same areas. So, you know, it's kind of like a weird subject that most people don't tackle. As I said, mainly because most people aren't even aware of it. And even those who are aware of it kind of shy away from it because it's so controversial. You know, it's one thing to talk about in Britain the Loch Ness Monster in Scotland or the big cat reports, but when you sort of hear like a 7-foot-tall, hairy ape-like creature wandering around the wilds of Scotland, you know, that's sort of a very different thing. No, I got it. I just wasn't pressing it hard enough. I'll just give you a little bit of background as to how I got interested in cryptozoology and weird creatures. Back in 1970, my parents took me on to Scotland for a week's holiday, and we spent one day at Loch Ness, which if you're going to go to Scotland, you've got to go to Loch Ness. And so, you know, I was only like 7 years old at the time, something like that. And so I only have a few sort of fragmentary memories of going to the loch. But I do remember sort of vaguely standing on the shore. This was the first time I went there, and sort of looking out, and my dad telling me this story about the Loch Ness Monster. And of course, when you're that age, you know, you sort of associate monster sightings with monsters in the closet or under the bed. You don't sort of look at it from the perspective of... Hang on. You don't sort of look at it from the perspective of sort of biological living creature. But then, you know, as I got older, began to read books on the subject, and sort of began to take research further and sort of going out into the field and investigating things. And so that's what really got me started in the field of looking for strange creatures and cryptozoology. And I run the US office of a British group called the Centre for Fortean Zoology. And for those of you who aren't aware of it, Fortean is a term named after a guy named Charles Fort. And Charles Fort was a guy, getting on for 100 years ago now, began writing about weird phenomena, whether strange creatures, UFOs, ghosts, paranormal things. And he wrote 5 books, which are sort of pretty much essential reading if you're interested in any aspect of, you know, the mysteries of the world. And so the Centre for Fortean Zoology basically focuses on, as you can probably guess from its title, weird animals. And we could launch various expeditions around the world looking for unusual creatures. That's included in the last 10 years going to Sumatra looking for the orang pendek, going to Russia looking for their equivalent of Bigfoot, which is known as the almasty. And interestingly, the almasty kind of sounds a little bit more like a wild sort of proto-human than it does an ape-like creature. They've also been to Guyana looking for giant snakes, and the Gambia looking for Macaulay and Bembe, which is this sort of dinosaur-type creature that's been reported in the jungle. So we try and get to go out into the field and do on-site investigations, because, you know, the internet can be a great resource tool, but it's no sort of excuse for getting out and looking for these things. You know, like the guys here today putting on the conference, if they don't go looking for Bigfoot, you're not going to find it. And so, you know, that's why field work, for me at least, is so important and significant. You know, if we're going to solve these mysteries, we've got to go out and look for these creatures. So that's what we do at the Centre for Fortean Zoology, and it's run by a friend of mine, John Downs. John lives in the south of England, and he coordinates all the expeditions that we go on, and it's all self-funded. You know, it's not like we're all driving around in Lamborghinis, you know, and you know, living in the Hollywood Hills or whatever. You know, we're sort of very much self-funded, and I think, unfortunately, although we have the dedication in the field, you know, to look for these things, I think one of the things that often prevents us getting the answers is that simply, you know, we don't unfortunately have $1 million, you know, to go out and spend 6 months in the woods, which if we were able to, then possibly, you know, we would answer some of these questions at a quicker pace. But I think the most important thing is what we all have, and all the guys here have today, is the dedication and the enthusiasm to look for these things. And I think that often counts for far more than, you know, actually the other issues as well, shall we say. I don't know if you can see that too well, but that's an old drawing from centuries ago of a so-called wild man, or as they were known in Britain centuries ago, woodwoes, which is W-O-O-D-W-O-S-E. And the woodwoes were pretty much like the reports that we get in the United States of so-called wild men in the woods. They look and sound far more like primitive people than apes. And I don't know if you can see it too well here, but this one's kind of holding like a club fashioned out of a tree limb. And again, that's what we get a lot of the reports from England, where these creatures seem to use weapons or tools. Now, these reports today are pretty much non-existent, but if you go back, say, to the 10th or the 11th century in England, which are sort of the early years of recorded history in terms of early books and things like that, you can find a lot of reports of these wild men of the woods. One of the most prevalent areas was the county of Suffolk in England, which is on the east coast. And from Suffolk, there are probably 7 or 8 reports spanning about 400 years of these so-called wild men. One of the most famous one was known as the Wild Man of Orford. Orford's a small town, a coastal town on the east side of England. And in the 1100s, there was a story about how a wild man was supposedly caught actually in the waters off the coast, in the sea. And it was described as looking very human-like, but with a thick, coarse coat of hair and a head of long hair. It wasn't sort of like, just like a gorilla's hair. It was actually like long, flowing hair. And he was supposedly caught and actually brought to Orford Castle. If you Google Orford Castle, there's an old castle, the remains of it, which are still there today. And supposedly the wild man was taken to the castle and over time was actually tamed, if you like, and when he was let loose again, he didn't run away. He supposedly came back to the castle, I guess he got somewhere to sleep and got fed every day and got used to it. But one day, apparently, so the story goes, he just ran off and never came back. Now, of course, if we just got one story like this, you could write it off as like a folkloric tale, local mythology, that sort of thing. But from the county of Suffolk itself, as I said, there's a number of reports on hand which span at least 4 or 5 centuries. There's also a small town in the area called Sproughton, and Sproughton has a pub in the village called the Wild Man, and it's called the Wild Man because it has this legend of a creature, again, very much like this, roaming the local woods. Now, people say, well, what could these creatures have been? Were they literal Bigfoot type creatures that because, they had a head, 2 arms, 2 legs and a body, but people assume they were some sort of human? Or could they have been, sort of proto-primitive human? One of the theories is, it's an incredible theory, and it's, it's an outlandish theory as well, but it's the idea that could it be that some of the early types of human actually survived far longer than we've assumed? A Cro-Magnon or Neanderthal man. Might they actually have, not become extinct in the time frames that history and archaeology suggest? Perhaps some isolated pockets might have lived for far longer. And that's what some people think about the Almasty in Russia, that does sound semi-human. And there are also stories of these wild men kidnapping human women and human girls, and who then get pregnant by them, and there's sort of like a crossbreed between the wild men and the human woman. Now, if that is occurring, then it would have to be some sort of primitive human, because despite rumours and legends of, sort of mating between gorillas and humans, there's never been any proof that that's actually occurred. You can find rumours and stories, and you can go to circuses and see old photographs, from these from circuses going back 50, 60 years, where there's supposedly somebody on display as half human and half ape. But these stories have never been proved to have a basis in reality. Now, if they do have a basis in reality, it would almost certainly have to be something that was semi-human, or an offshoot of Homo sapiens. So that's a possibility as well, that we're looking at something semi-human. And if we get into the science and the biology of it, one of the areas that kind of gives us a few clues to these hairy wild men, it may sound strange, but it's the subject of anorexia. And in particularly young girls, if they develop anorexia and it gets very, very serious and their body starts to decay, what happens is that the body fat begins to lose its fat at a quicker and quicker rate. And what happens from there is, not every time, but on some occasions, the body reacts by trying to find a way to preserve body heat. It's like in body fat, one of the reasons we have body fat is to keep us warm. And you find with anorexia, a lot of young girls who get anorexia, they get cold because your body fat is progressively vanishing. And what happens is that your body sometimes produces a type of hair. You can actually look it up on the internet. If you type in like anorexia plus hair growth, it'll tell you all about it, how the human body can start under certain circumstances to grow excessive hair. And it does this as sort of a byproduct and like an emergency process to cope with the fact that the body fat is getting less and less. So in other words, you imagine you've got, say, one part of England 700-800 years ago, a little isolated area where the people living in the wild, they don't have much food, they start to suffer from malnutrition, and they start to develop this fine coating of hair as a means to try and cope with the loss of body fat. And if you imagine from there that then they're out in the woods and they get covered in mud and filthy, etc., you can easily understand how these people might possibly be mistaken for definitive wild men. Now that doesn't take away the fact that some of the reports, the hair on these creatures is massively excessive. That doesn't occur, in cases like the rare examples of when it does occur in anorexia. But certainly I think some of these cases and legends might well possibly have their origins in a few stories along those lines. Now, moving on from the wild men reports and on to, I guess, what we would call definitive Bigfoot type reports. Certainly one of the most famous ones, and one of the earliest ones, involves a creature known as the man monkey. Now, we heard earlier on today about how, many of the skeptics say, well, Bigfoot reports haven't existed since the 1950s, it's just a new phenomenon. So if it's a new phenomenon, where are the old reports? Well, in the US, you can go back and look into newspapers of the 1800s and you will find reports of hairy man-like creatures, again that were very often called wild men, but today we would call them Bigfoot. The only difference is that the term Bigfoot didn't exist 100 years ago. It's the same in Britain, but we have these reports of Bigfoot type creatures, but obviously again in Britain the term Bigfoot didn't exist in the 1800s. Now, as I said, one of the most famous ones is a creature that's become known as the man monkey. Now, even the name man monkey, it's difficult when you're dealing with if you're dealing with a skeptic who said there's no such thing as Bigfoot and there are no reports. Well, how would you, describe a creature from the 1800s described as the man monkey? There's no closer way to describe a creature that sort of resembles something that looks like half a man and half an ape. But nevertheless, that's what gets reported. And the reason I got involved and interested in this particular story is that I used to live in a county in England called Staffordshire, which is in the centre part of England, sort of central England. And this particular story of the man monkey emanates from probably about 20 minutes drive from where I used to live. And it kind of looks like this sort of area. It's actually not too sort of far from cities and towns, but it's a very sort of heavily wooded fields, lakes, forests, that sort of thing. So, it is sort of the ideal location where stories like this would develop. Now, I don't know if you can see that too well, but that shows a bridge. That bridge crosses what's called the Shropshire Union Canal. This is a very long canal that runs through pretty much from the north of England right down to the centre part of England. And it was on this particular bridge in January 1879 that a guy was walking with his horse and cart over the bridge. He'd just been helping a friend to move house. And he said that as he was crossing this bridge, as you can see today, it's like a proper, tarmac road with white lines, etc. Back then it was just sort of like a muddy old bridge, and he was pulling his horse and cart across the bridge, and he said suddenly this creature jumped out of the trees surrounding the bridge itself. I don't know if you can see that too well, but it just shows, again, it demonstrates that the whole area is kind of filled with trees and foliage, and it's a very sort of dense wooded area. And the guy said that this creature bounded out of the trees and jumped onto the cart that his horse was pulling, scared the life out of the horse, which sort of galloped down the road, and he described it as looking like a large ape-like creature with what he said had shining eyes. And it's interesting that, of course, back then there was no internet, certainly no transatlantic newspapers going back and forth between Britain and America, and yet we have what sounds like eye shine. People talk about Bigfoot with eye shine today. And in the exact words of the guy who saw this creature, he said it had great shining eyes. Those were his exact words he used. So, that in itself, to me, is a pointer towards the idea that we're dealing with the same phenomenon. It may be called different things in one country, it may be called Bigfoot or Sasquatch here, it may be called the man-monkey 130 years ago in England, but really there's not that much difference between the two. Now, where I showed you the first picture where the road is, that was like there. So that's about 70 feet. So it's quite a very high bridge, and that's the canal below it. And throughout probably the next 10 or 15 years after this sighting occurred, there are actually quite regular reports of the man-monkey. And we still get reports from that particular area to this day. Now, of course, people say, well, what is it, or what was it? And one of the other interesting parallels between the British reports and the American reports is that, I'm sure many of you will know, that when it comes to trying to explain what Bigfoot is, you can go back and find numerous newspaper reports and folkloric tales where somebody said, oh, a circus came into town and a gorilla escaped, or a train crashed and a cave opened up and this huge monkey escaped, or whatever. If you type in sort of circus escapee plus Bigfoot on Google, you'll find a lot of stories going back sort of 120, 130 years. And the word lies as such, I think what it was just people trying to rationalise and explain why somebody might be seeing a large ape-like creature in the US, which simply shouldn't exist. And we get this in Britain with the man-monkey story. Around about the time that the first sighting occurred in January 1879, one of the local newspapers published a story saying that a gorilla had been seen in the area. And when people asked, well, what would a gorilla be doing running around the wilds of England, which is a good question, people said, oh, well, there was a travelling menagerie and it escaped and it was living in the wild for a few months before it died. And certainly, it probably would die, running around England in January, in winter time naked probably isn't the best thing to do if you want to survive, You'd probably freeze to death in a few weeks. But when checks were made, nobody could find any evidence of the existence of this circus, this travelling menagerie. So again, we have the same folkloric tale surfacing over here as we do in England when people try and explain what it is they're actually seeing. Now, that is a large communications tower in central England in a place called the Cannock Chase. The Cannock Chase it looks kind of just like this. You can see all the trees at the bottom, and that tower is probably about 200 feet high. And it's basically like a large communications tower for the entire area, like TV, radio, emergency services. One of the weird things is that a lot of Bigfoot reports in Britain have been made around this tower. And we get a few weird reports where Bigfoot seems to affect, it sounds strange, but where people have said it's had an effect on electrical equipment, or cameras sometimes don't work in its presence. And of course, this sort of takes things down a different, stranger path that's, a lot of researchers don't feel is necessarily even valid. They think may just be coincidence. But I'll just throw this in because it is an intriguing fact that many of these reports do surface right near this particular tower, which is known for having sort of a high energy output. Now, Another area which has been the site of many reports is a place called Castle Ring. Again, I don't think you can see that too well, but Castle Ring is a large Iron Age fort, again in central England, again in a very heavily wooded area, and there have been a lot of Bigfoot sightings from the Castle Ring. What's interesting about the Castle Ring is that when it was built about 4,000 years ago, it was built for its strategic location. It's actually one of the very highest points in all of central England. So, in terms of defending the area, so 4,000 years ago, for the people who lived there then, the primitive people, it was the perfect lookout spot to look out for invading tribes and things like that. And of course, people today have suggested, well, perhaps these Bigfoot creatures are doing exactly the same, but they're using it as sort of a lookout spot because it is one of the specifically highest places and it's still heavily wooded. If that is the case, that would suggest like a fairly high degree of intelligence and sort of sensibility and common sense. If you want to see who's watching you and you want to see who's approaching, well, what's the best thing to do? You go to the highest location and look down and survey and scan to see who's coming around, who's travelling around, who might be trying to film you, etc., etc. Now, I said it's going to be sort of like a transatlantic study of strange creatures because I live over here now, so when I came over to the US, I didn't sort of just say, oh well, I'm done, I'm going to have a look at what's in the United States. And of course, I live just outside Dallas, Texas, and of course, Dallas and Texas as a whole has a lot of wooded areas, and a lot of stories have developed of strange creatures throughout Texas as well. One of the most famous ones, or perhaps infamous ones, has become known as the Goat Man. Now, the Goat Man really sort of first surfaced in the summer of 1969 at Lake Worth, which is just outside the city of Fort Worth. People reported seeing this strange creature that, although it's called the Goat Man, that sort of name, it's sort of shrouded in mystery as to how it developed, because it didn't really look like a man, it didn't look like a goat either. This is sort of an artist's rendition done by a friend of mine named Simon Wyatt, and it's got like sort of a man-like figure but with goat-like protrusions or horns coming out of its head. The original stories, it's kind of vague and not really clear as to what the Goat Man looked like, but most people kind of claimed it was like a bipedal creature, hairy, etc., etc. Now, for me at least, if you're talking about a bipedal creature living in the woods that's hairy, it might just as well have been a Bigfoot. There's actually no reason why we have to sort of invoke a goat man type creature, which is sort of more like a mythical creature. You can go back into Roman and Greek folklore and hear stories of goat men and goat-headed creatures. But why shouldn't it have been a Bigfoot? I think it's a fair question. There were a lot of reports from the summer of 1969 around Lake Worth of people seeing the creature, of it running across roads, stories of it supposedly jumping on the hood of a car and hurling this huge tyre across like an open space of land where the people were watching it. And if you go back and look at a lot of the original newspaper reports from that period, there's this sort of crazy flurry of activity in the summer of 1969 really sort of dominated the people of Lake Worth. And then even to this day now, they have a festival, like a Saturday festival, where they sort of celebrate the story of the Goat Man. And they have, we can travel out to the locations, and they have stalls and bands playing and food and that sort of thing. So they really sort of embrace the story and the mystery. So in that sense, it's still ongoing and reported. A number of books have been written about this. Certainly the most famous one, the Goat Man of Lake Worth, written by Sally Ann Clark. I think is that the correct title, Craig? Yeah, Goat Man of Lake Worth. And that's probably one of the more essential books to read, because Sally Ann Clark was someone who was deeply involved in the early years of chronicling the story of the Goat Man. Now, that's one of the locations at Lake Worth, where the goatman was supposedly seen on this cliff area, hurled this tyre, supposedly 500 feet, through a truck tyre 500 feet at the crowd, but I don't know if there's any truth to that. It kind of sounds a little bit exaggerated, so I would imagine if he did throw it, he'd probably bounce and roll the last few hundred feet. Now, one of the reasons I bring up the whole idea of whether or not the goatman actually might have been a Bigfoot is that in many places where we get Bigfoot reports, we get these strange tree structures that some people call Bigfoot teepees. It's kind of like a simple description, if you like, but it's adequate for the purpose. Now this one of the things I should just backtrack and say is that although the sightings of the goatman began in 1969, they've actually carried on, although certainly not on the scale that was going on in 69, but they've carried on ever since. And I think the most recent report I had from that area is 2008. But that photograph was taken when I went out with a friend of mine, Ken Gerhard. Ken's a well-known cryptozoologist and author of a number of books. And you often see him on Monster Quest and shows like that. And we went out there in 2005 to a place at Lake Worth called Greer Island. Greer Island's this small body of land, like a small island, which is attached to Lake Worth itself by just a small crossing of land. And there are times when the water comes up and you just cannot access it, but when you can get out to Greer Island. And we found this weird tree structure on there. Didn't find any footprints or anything like that, but we did find a large area of flattened ground, which was sort of like that, as if something heavy had sat there. And as you can see, it kind of doubles over there. You have other limbs going up there, and probably from there to there that was maybe about 6 feet across, something like that. And I think we only found 3 or 4 of those out there. So, given the fact that they're associated with Bigfoot, and contrary to what a lot of people assume, the goatman was never reported to be huge, like goat-like horns or hoofs or anything like that, I think we have to give some consideration to the idea that the name of the goatman is actually kind of biased and coloured as to people's opinions on what might actually have been seen. Now, to give you another example of one of these formations, this one I found out at Lake Ray Roberts, which is just north of Denton, Texas, in January 2008. There have been various reports of Bigfoot-type creatures seen around Lake Ray Roberts going back to about 1990. And many of these were associated with a creature that would scream and wail late at night. It was a lot of reports described a creature that sounded quite violent. In many reports, Bigfoot is sort of it'll bluff or it'll hide, and it almost sort of toy with people and play with them. But you don't really see any outright aggressive behaviour. Some of the reports that were coming out of Ray Roberts Lake, were actually of a creature that sounded pretty aggressive. And I went out there with a friend of mine named Lance Oliver, who runs a group called the Denton Area Paranormal Society. We went out there in January 2008 to where there have been a lot of reports, and travelled out to one particular large hilly area where pretty much all the original reports surfaced from. And to give you an idea, it's probably like a 45-minute walk through the woods to actually get to this particular place, and you're up and down and sort of digging your way through very, very dense trees. And we found at least 8 or 9 formations like this, where you can see you've got, like, again, a crossing branch, an upright one, 2 diagonals, and various other ones. Now these branches were like that. They weren't sort of like small twigs that somebody would just bend. That one there was literally something. I've actually got another photograph which I don't have with me, unfortunately, but where we just balanced a coin on top like a quarter, so you could gauge the size. But some of these, what was interesting about these, some of them have been bent. Some of them were actually snapped and put into place. None of them were, sawn. There was no evidence of like a saw being used or anything like that. But when you actually see something like this, where it's bent and wrenched and snapped, then that takes a lot of strength to do that. You know, we're not talking about, I think, somebody just putting the foot on one end, you know, and then snapping it. You know, that would take a lot of power. As I said, we found quite a few of those, and even some smaller ones as well that were just like, you know, maybe a foot high. And of course the big question is, well, you know, what are they? What's the purpose behind them? And it is a good question. You know, some people wonder, could they be like a territorial marker? You know, could these creatures build these things either as, you know, to invite others of their kind along, or to warn them to stay away? You know, could they be like signpost markers, something like that? You know, I'll be the first to admit we're very much sort of scratching our heads, so to speak, when it comes to trying to understand the nature or origin of them. But one thing we can say for sure is that where we get Bigfoot reports, we very often find things like that. And even in England, there was a spate of sightings of a place called Bowland Wood in the early part of 2002. Bowland Wood's in the north of England. And there were structures very similar to those found there as well. So, you know, I think when, you know, if you go out in the woods and you see something like that and you think, oh, you know, somebody just been camping and decided to build a shelter, you know, it may not be. Or it may be somebody's shelter, but it may not even be a human shelter. That gives you an idea of Lake Ray Roberts. Very, very large lake. Woods on either side. The picture I just showed you, if the picture is wider, it'll be up here. It's sort of very sort of steep climb to actually get to the area where we found these formations. That's one of my books, Memoirs of a Monster Hunter, which details the investigation that I did with Ken at Lake Worth into the Goatman. Now, sort of moving further south in Texas, not too far from the city of Houston, is a large area of forest called the Big Thicket. And I found talking to people, even in the US, a lot of Americans don't realise how heavily forested East Texas actually is. You know, before I moved over, I thought Texas was all, you know, desert and John Wayne films and things like that. You know, it's only when I actually moved here to live that I realised that sort of the perception that people have of Texas is probably like the perception a lot of people have of England, where it's always raining and you're sitting around drinking tea all day long, which actually isn't too far from the truth, but nevertheless. Not too far from Houston anyway is the Big Thicket forest. And that's sort of a massive area of heavily forested land. And right through the Big Thicket runs a place called Bragg Road, or as it's known locally, Ghost Road. It's called Ghost Road because it has an intriguing history. There have been a lot of Bigfoot reports and Wildman reports, but the reason it's called Ghost Road is because it has a long history as well of something that's known as the Big Thicket Ghost Light. I'm sure many of you have heard of the so-called Martha lights, these sort of strange balls of light that have been reported around the town of Martha, Texas. That are, I won't call them UFOs, that's the wrong way to describe them, because they're described as like small tennis ball size globs of light that sort of float and flit around. And the Big Thicket's Ghost Light Road has a similar tradition of these lights, and this is where we also get a lot of Bigfoot reports and Wildman reports. I guess the strangest thing is that from deep in the heart of the Big Thicket there have been a number of reports as well over the years about, and again this sounds pretty incredible, but reports of isolated pockets of surviving Native American tribes. Certainly they're not, you know, they're like from the last 20, 30, 40 years, but you can go back to the 1930s and 1940s and find people, locals, who said, you know, they were deep hunting in the woods and saw this guy on a horseback who, you know, looked just like a Native American, you know, from the 1800s, 1700s. And a friend of mine, Rob Riggs, wrote a book about these various mysteries of the Big Thicket called In the Big Thicket. And if you haven't got that book, it's a very good book which, from a historical perspective, tells the story of pretty much all the significant sightings And again, it's interesting that with the British parallels, we get reports from the Big Thicket of classic Bigfoot-type creatures, but also the more human-looking wildman-type creatures as well. Again, the reason, I don't know. I mean, some people have actually wondered if sort of the less hairy ones could be more like a juvenile version of the more hairy ones. It's difficult to say, but I think sort of the onus is on us to chronicle these reports and file them, and not sort of get too preoccupied with saying it's definitely this or that. Let's just sort of look at all the evidence and see where it leads. That's just like a local marker in the area that tells you the history of all the mysteries that populate the Big Thicket. And I said, if you ever get a chance to go down there and spend a few days, it's well worth doing, because if you go into the local towns like Coombe, all the people there know the stories, and that's one of the great things about that area, is that the people are happy to talk about it, and you can develop a massive amount of leads and research data just by going into town and saying, hey, tell me about the Bigfoot sightings. Now that one, I don't know if you can see that at all well, but I took that picture when I was out there with Rob Riggs in 2005. That's the main road that runs through Ghost Light Road. And one of the things I would say is, if you ever go along that road, don't do what I did, which is drive a Ford Taurus, because this is like 3-inch thick dust, and it doesn't do much good for your engines. Have something a bit more sturdy than a Ford Taurus. But if you can see on this picture, there's like a light in the sky there. That's actually one of the little ghost lights that we saw. And if anybody actually wants sort of a high-res picture of it, if you want to email me, you can reach me at nick_redfern@sbcglobal.net. I'll be happy to email you a copy of the original photograph, which I don't think you can see there, but there's a few people walking along, so they're sort of 6 feet. That's sort of about 35 feet in the sky. And there are no lights there, no lampposts, nothing like that at all. It's just a sort of a weird little mystery that happens to exist in the same place where people are reporting Bigfoot. That's a book that I co-wrote with Ken, who I mentioned earlier, Ken Gerhardt, Monsters of Texas, which addresses again the Big Thicket story, the Goatman story, and a few others. That's Caddo Lake, another place where I've done quite a few investigations. Caddo Lake has its own history as well, the late monster, a Bigfoot tradition, again going back a very long time. And it's sort of a spooky, weird place, not too far from the town of Jefferson. Jefferson has also been the site of a number of reports. There was a famous one back in the 1960s, where somebody, supposedly a young boy, saw a hairy, ape-like creature come running out of the trees. And as far as the Caddo Lake reports are concerned, I think the most recent one that I had was about 2007, and this was from a truck driver who was driving along one of the main roads near to Caddo Lake, and said he saw this sort of hairy-like creature actually not race across the road but amble across the road, and he said he was actually forced to slow down. The creature was just almost strolling across. He said almost, although he was amazed, he almost made him laugh as well, because it was out for like a Sunday afternoon stroll or something like that, but it was sort of 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and so very, very, very weird report. And in terms of sort of ongoing investigations, it's one of these situations where I get a lot of reports, from people who have seen these creatures in Texas, and for me, the Texas reports, I consider them sort of as significant as the British reports, because I think, unfortunately, it's one of these situations where Bigfoot, I won't say gets a bad rap, but it's like when everybody thinks of Bigfoot, they always think of the Pacific Northwest. They don't necessarily think of Oklahoma or Texas. And I think when they do think outside of the Pacific Northwest, the first assumption is the skunk out of Florida. So, I think the Oklahoma guys and the research that's been done, it's not only valuable because it adds to the body of material we've got, but it demonstrates the sheer wide range of reports that have been, picked up from all across the United States. And again, that's the same with Britain. And I think the more we can look into these stories and get across to people that, hey, these aren't just new cases, they actually date back centuries and they span the entire planet, then we're clearly dealing with, a global phenomenon that has a long history. And, I would be the first to admit that if we could only demonstrate that reports went back 50 or 60 years and it was in one localised area, that would be a problem. It would be a big problem. But the fact that, contrary to what the skeptics tell us, and the debunkers love to tell us even more, that, Bigfoot didn't exist till 1958 or whatever, it's just plain not true. And I actually don't think these people are lying. They just don't bother doing the research, They just don't want to get out into the field and look for these things. They don't want to go to the little towns and villages and speak with the locals and learn that there's a tradition of a wild man going back 500 or 600 years. So I hope that's sort of given you a few insights into, I guess, some of the weirder aspects of certain Bigfoot cases, but also to demonstrate that, again, contrary to what people think, Bigfoot is very much a global phenomenon and also reported in little tiny countries like where I come from on a startlingly regular basis. And if anybody's got any questions about anything that I brought up or anything I didn't bring up, I'll be happy to answer them, or if not, we can get the next speaker.
Something I was actually wanting to bring up is I've been doing some research, and there's actually some paintings from what they call trolls. Some of the paintings, if you would actually compare them to a modern day Bigfoot report, they're virtually identical.
If you couldn't hear that over the wind, the question was, or the observation was, that in a lot of Scandinavian folklore, they have stories of trolls. Trolls, actually, you're quite right, if you look at the descriptions or some of the old pictures, they look like Bigfoot. They're a man-like creature covered in hair that would sort of live and dwell in the mountains and the forests and would sort of keep themselves to themselves, but occasionally, would interact with people. And I think, the best way I can probably describe this is to say, one person's Bigfoot is another person's troll, is somebody else's wild man. Depending on the culture and the country and the folklore, stories develop around what these creatures might be. But what it comes down to is no matter where they're being seen, clearly people are seeing something. And I think that's the important thing. It doesn't matter what the local name is, the man-monkey, Sasquatch, it doesn't matter. It's the phenomenon itself that's being reported, and I think that's the important thing. It's kind of like, this might kind of sound strange, but if you go back into English folklore, you get a lot of stories of fairies. Now, everybody's impression of fairies today is actually a relatively recent image, the idea that these little ethereal creatures with wings that flit around and fly around. That's the original folklore in England of fairies, was that they were sort of shadowy, ancient, primitive creatures that would live in caves and woods and sort of raid farms and steal food late at night. And some of them were covered in hair. And they actually sound far more like the so-called Orang Pendek of Sumatra, which is this smaller ape-like creature, than they do, this image of, little female fairies with wings is actually only a couple of centuries old. They're actually quite sinister, shadowy, primitive animals that would, as I said, would raid farms and homes. So I think, we can actually dig further and further back into culture and folklore and possibly assign some of these presumed mythical creatures into more of like a Bigfoot category. Alrighty, well, thanks a lot, and I think we've got Lyle up next, isn't it?